When I first took the night shift at St. Mark's Hospital, I thought it would be quiet. A paycheck for watching over empty hallways and the occasional patient in the ER. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy, and easy was what I needed. St. Mark's wasn't like the big hospitals in the city. It was old, half-abandoned, with most of the upper floors closed off after the new wing was built. The patients they got were usually locals who couldn't make it to the city in time. That meant long, dull hours for me. Or so I thought. It was my third night on the job when I first noticed it, the elevator in the East Wing. It was strange because that wing was supposed to be empty. A sign in bold letters on the stairwell doors read, "No admittance, under renovation." But when I glanced at the security monitors, the light for the elevator was on, the digital display showing it was moving, up and down, up and down. Faulty wiring, I muttered to myself. That's what the day shift guy had said when I asked about the elevator the night before. Old place like this? It's bound to glitch sometimes. But tonight, it didn't feel like a glitch. I stood in front of the monitor, watching as the elevator moved to the 4th floor, stayed there for a few seconds, then descended to the basement. Then back up again. No pattern, no reason, just endless motion. It didn't help that the 4th floor was one of the closed-off areas. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my rounds, walking the dimly lit hallways with a flashlight. Most of the rooms were empty, save for the occasional sound of a sleeping patient or the soft hum of medical equipment. By the time I made it back to the security desk, the elevator had stopped. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Just as I sat down, the phone on the desk rang, a loud, shrill sound that made me jump. I hesitated before picking it up. St. Mark's, night security. At first, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then a voice broke through, faint and uneven, like it was coming from far away. "Help us," it whispered. My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, my pulse pounding in my ears. The elevator display on the monitor flickered back to life, its light glowing faintly. And this time, it stopped on the 4th floor. I stared at the monitor, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The elevator had stopped on the 4th floor, and the light on the panel blinked steadily. I told myself it was just another glitch, but the voice from the phone still echoed in my mind. "Help us." I could have ignored it. I could have called maintenance, written it up in the log, and waited until morning. But something about the way the light blinked, rhythmic and deliberate, made me feel like it was waiting for me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the East Wing. The air grew colder as I approached the stairwell, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. I hesitated at the door, the sign warning me again that the area was closed, but I pushed it open and stepped inside. The stairwell was dark, the overhead lights flickering faintly. My footsteps echoed as I climbed, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the 4th floor, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or fear. The door to the 4th floor was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled through the crack, casting a long shadow across the stairs. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The hallway beyond was a relic of another time. Peeling wallpaper, faded tiles, and old, rusted gurneys left to gather dust. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. No answer. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, its beam cutting through the gloom. The doors to the patient rooms were closed, their windows streaked with grime. But at the end of the hall, one door was open, and from within came the faint rustle of papers, like someone flipping through a stack with deliberate care. I stepped forward, my footsteps hesitant and deliberate. The sound of my breathing seemed too loud, echoing off the cracked walls. When I reached the open door, I hesitated, shining the flashlight inside. The room was bare, containing only a rusted hospital bed and a ceiling fixture coated in dust, its dull presence adding to the oppressive stillness. The walls were bare, the floor dusty, but the bed was pristine, its sheets clean and tightly tucked, as if someone had just made it. And then I saw the handprint. It was smeared across the wall above the bed, a dark red stain that looked fresh. The shape of it was unmistakable, narrow, bony imprints, almost skeletal, pressed into the peeling paint. I backed away, my heart racing. That was when I heard it, a low, guttural hum, resonating from somewhere behind me, growing steadily louder. I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the hallway. There was no one there, and then the elevator chimed. The chime echoed down the empty hallway, unnaturally loud in the stillness. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned toward the sound. The elevator doors at the far end of the corridor were open. I couldn't see inside, only the faint, flickering lights spilling out into the hallway. The whispering started again, low and rhythmic, crawling beneath my skin. It wasn't coming from the room or the walls this time. It was coming from the elevator. Every instinct screamed for me to turn around, to leave the fourth floor and never come back. But my feet carried me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, the whispers growing louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. When I reached the elevator, I hesitated just outside the doors. The air was colder here, biting against my skin despite the layers I was wearing. It's just my imagination, right? I called, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped. I leaned forward slightly, shining the flashlight into the elevator. The interior was pristine, gleaming metal walls, spotless tiles, the kind of clean that didn't belong in this decaying wing. But then I noticed the buttons. They were all lit, every single one glowing faintly, even for floors that didn't exist. The panel went well beyond the hospital's 6 floors, with numbers climbing into the 20s and 30s. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. The whispering returned, louder now, overlapping voices that seemed to rise and fall in a chaotic rhythm. And then faintly, I heard it again. Help us. The voice was clearer this time, more distinct. It wasn't a whisper. It was a plea, desperate and raw. I didn't think. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed instantly, sealing me inside. The buttons flickered erratically, and the elevator lurched, descending rapidly. My stomach churned as the numbers on the panel began to flash. 10, 8, 6, 3, but it didn't stop at the lobby. It kept going. The whispers surrounded me now, filling the elevator with a deafening roar. The lights overhead flickered, plunging me into brief, strobe-like darkness. Then, with a jarring screech, the elevator came to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing a place that didn't belong. The hallway beyond was shrouded in shadow, the walls cracked and seeping with moisture. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rot and decay. I stepped out cautiously, my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The whispers stopped again, replaced by something worse. A soft, wet dragging sound coming from somewhere deep in the corridor ahead. The dragging sound echoed down the hallway, each wet, deliberate pull sending a chill racing down my spine. My flashlight trembled as I pointed it into the gloom, but the beam seemed to dissolve in the oppressive darkness ahead. I took a hesitant step forward, the soles of my shoes sticking slightly to the damp, uneven floor. The walls were worse up close, cracked and oozing with something black and foul-smelling, like tar. The air felt thicker here, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. "Hello," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The dragging sound stopped. I froze, the silence pressing in around me like a living thing. My breath came shallow and quick, my pulse pounding so loudly in my ears that I almost didn't hear it. A faint, soft whisper. "We're here." The voice was different this time. Closer, clearer, and distinctly not alone. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping in an unsettling harmony. "Where?" I choked out, my throat dry. There was no answer, but a door on the left side of the hallway creaked open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. A faint light spilled out, flickering like a dying bulb. I didn't want to go. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to find the elevator and get the hell out of there. But the same force that had brought me this far kept pushing me forward. The door opened wider as I approached, revealing a room that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. Rows of rusted hospital beds lined the walls, their frames warped and bent. The air was icy and smelled faintly of bleach, masking something sour that lingered just underneath. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight across the room. Most of the beds were empty, their mattresses stained and sagging, but the bed closest to the far corner wasn't. A shape lay beneath the sheet, its outline disturbingly human. My stomach churned as I took another step closer. The whispers began to rise again, filling the room like a chorus, their voices weaving together in an unholy rhythm. "Help us," they said again, and this time, the words carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. I reached the bed, my hand trembling as I grabbed the corner of the sheet. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was pleading with. I pulled the sheet back. The body beneath was skeletal, its flesh gray and shriveled, as though it had been there for years. But its eyes were wide open, black and glistening, staring straight at me. Its mouth moved. "You shouldn't have come." The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, and the body on the bed lurched forward, its bony hands reaching for me. The skeletal hands closed around my wrist, their grip impossibly strong and ice cold. I screamed, stumbling back, but the thing on the bed didn't let go. Its hollow, black eyes bored into mine, unblinking and full of something worse than death, something alive. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped again, its voice layered with the whispers that filled the room. I yanked my arm back with all the strength I could muster, the sound of cracking bones echoing as its grip finally broke. I staggered away, my flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling, its beam casting wild shadows across the walls. The thing on the bed sat up, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring every second. Its head tilted unnaturally, the vertebrae in its neck creaking like old wood. "Leave," it said, though the whispers around me screamed something else entirely. "Stay." I lunged for the flashlight, grabbing it just as the creature slid off the bed. Its feet hit the floor with a wet, squelching sound, and it began to move toward me, its skeletal frame dragging unevenly across the tiles. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned, sprinting for the door. The whispers followed, louder and more chaotic, as though the entire hospital had come alive with voices. The hallway was even darker now, the faint light from the elevator at the far end flickering weakly. The dragging sound from earlier had returned, but now it was everywhere, coming from all directions. I ran, my breath ragged, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The doorways I passed were no longer empty. Figures stood in the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they watched me. "Help us," one of them whispered, its voice low and mournful. "Stay with us," said another, its tone more sinister. I didn't stop. The elevator was just ahead, its doors mercifully open. The panel inside was dark, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get inside. I hurled myself into the elevator, frantically pounding the closed door button as the air grew heavy with the sound of shuffling limbs. The figures emerged from the shadows, their twisted, contorted forms dragging themselves forward. Their broken bodies moved with a grotesque rhythm, their steps deliberate, as if savoring the chase. Their hollow, featureless faces turned toward me, and though they had no eyes, I felt their gaze burn into mine. The door slid shut with a grinding metallic groan, but not before the first of them reached the threshold. Its jagged, skeletal fingers clawed against the metal, leaving deep gouges before it disappeared into the dark beyond. For a moment, there was silence. Then the elevator jolted, descending rapidly, the dim, overhead light flickering erratically. The panel lit up, and the numbers began to flash again. 2-1, B1, but it didn't stop. The whispers returned, softer now, as though they were inside the elevator with me. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't help. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors slid open to reveal a place even darker than before. The whispers fell silent, but somewhere in the shadows ahead, I heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, slow and deliberate, coming closer. The air beyond the elevator was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint glow from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The dragging sound grew louder, each wet pull echoing through the space like a heartbeat. I didn't want to step out, but staying in the elevator wasn't an option. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers growing faint but persistent, circling just beyond my hearing. With a shaky breath, I stepped into the unknown. The floor was uneven, slick with moisture that smelled faintly metallic. My boots squelched with every step, the sound merging with the dragging that seemed to come from everywhere. The walls were rough stone, damp and crumbling, and they felt far older than the hospital above. I turned the flashlight in all directions, hoping to find something, anything that made sense. What kind of hospital had a place like this beneath it? The dragging sound stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the silence pressed against my ears. My flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam bouncing slightly as I struggled to steady my breathing. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and trembling, coming from somewhere ahead. "Please help me." It wasn't like the whispers. This voice was clear, human, and filled with desperation. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was this real? Or was it another trick? "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. "Please," the voice repeated, weaker this time. "I'm trapped." Against my better judgment, I moved toward the sound. The corridor widened slightly, the walls opening into a cavernous space that made my flashlight feel useless. Shadows danced in the faint light, twisting into shapes that made my stomach churn. Then I saw her. A woman sat slumped against the far wall, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her clothes were torn, and her hands trembled as she reached out toward me. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. I ran to her, dropping to my knees. "What happened? How did you get down here?" Her eyes darted past me, wide and full of fear. "It's coming," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to leave. Now." A chill ran through me as the dragging sound returned, louder than before. It wasn't far now, just beyond the edge of the light. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. She was cold to the touch, her skin clammy and fragile, but she moved with surprising ease. "Go," she hissed, her voice sharp with panic. We stumbled back toward the corridor, the sound of dragging growing louder with every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air behind us felt wrong, heavy and thick, like something immense was bearing down on us. The whispers started again, louder and more chaotic, overlapping in a din of voices that clawed at my thoughts. "Faster," the woman urged, her grip tightening on my arm. The elevator was just ahead, its doors still open, the dim light inside a beacon in the darkness. We ran, the sound of dragging now joined by something else, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. We reached the elevator, and I shoved her inside before slamming my hand against the closed door button. The growling stopped, the doors slid shut, and for a moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing. I turned to the woman, my heart still pounding. "What the hell is going on?" Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I noticed something strange about her expression. Too calm, too blank. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "It's not over," she said. And then the elevator began to rise, but the buttons on the panel weren't lit. The elevator shuddered as it rose, the faint hum of its machinery eerily muted. My hand hovered over the panel, but none of the buttons were lit, and pressing them did nothing. I turned to the woman. She stood motionless in the corner, her pale face half hidden in the dim light. "You said it's not over," I said, my voice trembling. "What did you mean?" She didn't answer. Her head tilted slightly, her wide eyes fixed on something beyond me. "Hey," I shouted, my panic bubbling over. "Talk to me. What's going on down there?" She finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You should have left when you had the chance." The elevator jolted, throwing me off balance. The lights overhead flickered, and the whispers returned, faint and insidious, crawling into my thoughts like worms. "What chance?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "It doesn't matter now. You're part of it. The elevator stopped abruptly, the sudden stillness pressing against my ears. The doors slid open, revealing another hallway. It wasn't like the corridors above or the cavernous space below. This one was clean and bright, its walls painted a sterile white. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their glow sharp and clinical, reflecting off the polished tiles. I stepped forward hesitantly, the woman following close behind me. "Where are we?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Her smile faded, and for the first time, she looked afraid. "I don't know," she admitted. "This wasn't here before." The whispers grew louder, echoing through the hallway. They weren't chaotic now. They were deliberate, a low, rhythmic chant that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors were already closing. "Wait!" I shouted, lunging for them, but they shut with a final, mechanical thud, leaving us trapped in the strange corridor. The lights overhead flickered and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air as the whispers rose to a deafening roar. And then, at the far end of the hallway, something moved. A figure stepped into the light, its form unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its head tilted as it looked at us, its face a pale, featureless void. The woman grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Run," she whispered. We sprinted down the hallway, the whispers chasing us, their rhythmic chant growing louder with every step. The lights flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. The figure followed, its movements slow and deliberate, yet somehow it was always closer than it should have been. A door appeared ahead, its surface pristine and white, standing out against the endless corridor. I threw myself against it, twisting the handle frantically. It wouldn't budge. "Open!" I shouted, slamming my shoulder into the door. The woman reached past me, her hands trembling, and pressed something against the handle. There was a soft click, and the door swung open. We stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving us in heavy, suffocating silence. I turned to the woman, gasping for breath. "What is that thing?" She didn't answer. Her pale face twisted into a grimace, and she pressed her back against the door, as though trying to hold something at bay. "You shouldn't have followed it," she said quietly, her voice tinged with despair. "Followed what?" I demanded, my voice rising. Her gaze locked onto mine, her expression hollow. The sound, her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. "The sound? What are you talking about?" I demanded, though my voice was shaky. "I didn't follow anything. I was dragged into this." The woman didn't answer right away. She pressed herself harder against the door, as if bracing for something to burst through, her pale face set in a mask of quiet desperation. "It calls to you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once you hear it, it knows you. It doesn't let go." My chest tightened. "What doesn't let go?" "That thing?" Her head shook, but she didn't meet my gaze. "It's not just one thing. It's part of something bigger. The ward, the hospital, the whole place is alive with it." I staggered back, my hands clutching at my hair. "You're not making any sense," I shouted. "Why me? Why any of this?" She finally looked at me, her eyes hollow and resigned. "Because the sound found you. It found me 2 years ago." My heart sank. "Years?" She nodded slowly, her expression twisting into something like guilt. "I've been down here ever since." The weight of her words settled over me, but before I could respond, a faint noise broke the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping, coming from the other side of the door. The woman's body stiffened. Her hands pressed harder against the door, as though trying to seal it shut. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's too soon. It can't be here already." The tapping grew louder, joined by a wet, dragging sound that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I stepped back, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't help. "What's out there?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her eyes darted to mine, wide with fear. "It's here for you." The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the walls. The woman's grip on the door faltered, her arms shaking as though the weight on the other side was too much to hold back. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing her shoulder. "No," she snapped, her voice sharp and panicked. "There's nowhere to go. It always finds you." The growling grew louder, deeper, shaking the very floor beneath us. The door shuddered violently, and for a brief moment, I thought it would splinter apart. But then everything stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The woman's trembling slowed, her breathing ragged as she leaned heavily against the door. "It's gone," she said, though her voice carried no relief. I wasn't convinced. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, another exit, something to defend myself with, but the room was barren. The walls were smooth and white, the floor spotless, and the ceiling buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. Then the whispers started again. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew quickly, filling the room with their overlapping chaos. The woman's eyes widened in horror. "No, no, no, no. What?" I asked, stepping closer. "What's happening now?" She didn't answer. Her body sagged against the door, her lips moving silently as the whispers rose to a deafening roar. And then the light flickered, plunging the room into darkness. The darkness was complete, pressing against my skin like a living thing. I fumbled for my flashlight, my trembling fingers struggling to find the switch. When the beam finally cut through the blackness, it revealed nothing but the pale face of the woman staring back at me. Her expression was frozen in terror. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she was trying to say something, but no words came out. "Talk to me," I shouted, the sound of my own voice jarring against the oppressive silence. She raised a shaking hand, pointing behind me. I didn't want to turn. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, to hide, to do anything but look. But the whispers left me no choice. They surged around me, louder now, their chaotic rhythm crashing like waves in my head. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the center of the room. The shadows that were deeper, darker than they should have been, swirling and shifting like smoke. As the light hit them, they recoiled slightly, only to surge forward again, forming a shape that towered above me. The dim light overhead wavered, plunging the room into brief darkness before flickering back to life. In that fractured moment, something shifted. My breath caught as I saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall and disturbingly thin, stretching unnaturally across the wall. It moved with a slowness that wasn't human, each jerking step deliberate and wrong, like it was testing its own ability to exist. Its form didn't quite make sense, the edges blurring as though it wasn't fully there. Yet the oppressive weight of its presence filled the room. The faint, scraping sound of something dragging along the floor accompanied its movement, though no visible object caused it. My chest tightened as it passed before the light, blocking it entirely for a fraction of a second, before continuing its unnatural, deliberate path. The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, low voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't escape." I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. Its presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. "You open the way," it said, its voice layered with too many tones. "You will close it." The woman grabbed my arm, her grip like ice. "Don't listen to it," she hissed, her voice sharp and panicked. I turned to her, desperate for answers. "What does it mean? What's the way?" Her lips parted to answer, but before she could speak, the shadow surged forward. It moved faster than I could process, its form collapsing and expanding, wrapping around us like a shroud. The flashlight's beam flickered wildly as the shadows engulfed me, pulling me down into suffocating blackness. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the very fabric of reality was pressing against me. And then I was falling. The whispers returned, but they weren't chaotic this time. They were rhythmic, deliberate, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Seal the way, seal the way." The fall seemed endless, the darkness swallowing everything. My body felt weightless, my thoughts unraveling with every passing second. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the falling stopped. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing echoing in the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back. The pit loomed before me, its edges crumbling and damp, the surrounding air thick with the stench of rot. The rusted cover was gone, revealing a gaping maw of darkness below. A faint, flickering glow emanated from its depths, pulsing like a heartbeat. The woman's voice echoed faintly in my mind. "It's not over." My hands shook as I crawled toward the pit, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Whatever this was, whatever I had started, I had to end it. The air around the chasm was oppressive, pressing against me with an unseen, suffocating weight. The faint light pulsing from its depths painted jagged, shifting patterns across the clearing, and the whispers began again, softer this time, but no less relentless, crawling into my mind like an unshakable presence. "Sealed away. Sealed away." My hands trembled as I crawled closer, the stench of decay growing stronger with every inch. The edges of the pit were jagged and cold beneath my fingers, slick with an unidentifiable slime. As I stared into the gaping darkness below, a deep, guttural sound emanated from its depths, a slow, rhythmic thrum that resonated in my chest like a heartbeat. "Is this what you wanted?" I shouted, my voice raw and cracking. "What does it mean to seal the way?" The whispers gave no answer, but the thrum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and walls, sending tremors up my arms. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the presence of something vast and ancient. Then I saw it, the thing from the depths, the source of the whispers, the growls, and the dragging sounds, was rising. Its form was a writhing mass of shifting shapes, impossible to define, like liquid smoke coalescing into something that defied comprehension. Eyes blinked in and out of existence across its surface, locking onto me for brief, sickening moments before vanishing back into the chaos. The weight of its gaze pressed into my mind, flooding it with images that didn't belong, fractured worlds, endless voids, and forms too grotesque to exist in any reality I knew. "You opened the way," the layered voice thundered, its vibrations tearing through the oppressive thrum. "You will close it." I staggered back, my pulse pounding in my ears. "How?" I screamed, desperation tearing at my voice. "Tell me how." The thrum reached a fever pitch, accompanied by the ground beneath me trembling violently. Cracks spidered outward from the pit, and thick, black ichor seeped upward, glistening as it spread like veins through the stone. The shadowy mass loomed higher, its tendrils reaching for me with a deliberate, suffocating intent. I felt the cold, crushing grip of its presence coil around my chest like invisible chains, squeezing the breath from my lungs. "You are the seal," the voice declared, each word hammering into me with the force of a physical blow. The realization struck me like a thunderclap. The old woman's warning echoed in my mind. "It always finds you." The only way to stop it was to take its place. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as tears blurred my vision. "There has to be another way." The lashed out, coiling around my arms and legs, dragging me relentlessly toward the pit. The sound of the thrumming became unbearable, as though it were tearing apart the very fabric of my thoughts. "Please," I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. "I don't want this." But there was no mercy. They tightened, their cold touch burning into my skin as they pulled me into the depths of the pit. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the pit anymore. I stood in the hallway of the hospital, the sterile white walls glowing faintly under the dull hum of fluorescent lights. My body felt impossibly heavy, as though I carried the weight of the pit itself. I glanced down at my arms and saw them, dark, branching marks that twisted like living veins of shadow, crawling under my skin. The elevator doors slid open behind me with a soft chime. Inside stood the woman, her hollow eyes softened slightly, and she almost seemed relieved. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice laced with exhaustion. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The crushing weight in my chest told me everything I needed to know. The pit was sealed. For now. But I wasn't free. The whispers lingered, faint yet insistent, coiling in the recesses of my mind like a serpent waiting to strike. They were patient. They would wait for the seal to weaken, for the moment it would break again. And when it did, I would be the one waiting in the dark,